In 1917, during the First World War, United States President Woodrow Wilson, a known racist, compromised his personal principles for practical purpose when he signed the Selective Service Act of 1917, which allowed the commissioning of African American officers, a key move in propelling the U.S. to victory in military conflict and creating a permanent pathway to racial progress. In the late 1800s, racial segregation was a common theme in American life. Although slavery was legally abolished at the end of the Civil War, the Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy ruling and Jim Crow laws created nearly a century of racial division by making de facto segregation an acceptable practice throughout society. With the rise of political tensions in Europe that brought the start of World War I in 1914, America prepared for the possibility of war by mobilizing troops throughout the country. Although African Americans had fought in every American war, they had been largely limited to serving as rank-and-file soldiers under the direction of white officers. When Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1916, he gave no indication that any change was in store. In fact, Wilson revealed personal racial bias in his 1901 book, A History of the American People, when he wrote, "The white men of the South were aroused by the mere instinct of self-preservation to rid themselves, by fair means or foul, of the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes." Although many African Americans showed interest in joining the war effort, there was a rising resistance among a growing segment of the black community who refused to enlist unless African Americans were offered military leadership opportunities. On March 15, 1917, Robert Russa Moton, president of the Tuskegee Institute, wrote a letter to assure Wilson that African Americans were willing to do their part to support the war effort, and thereby lessened pressure on the president to compromise his principles. "I am writing to assure you that you and the nation can count absolutely on the loyalty of the mass of Negroes of our country, and its people, North and South, as in previous wars, will find the Negro people rallying almost to a man to our flag." When the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted in 1917, America relinquished its neutral position and entered the war. However, the United States was not as well equipped for battle as their allies in Europe. With a large number of white recruits unable to pass physical exams, the U.S. military faced a manpower shortage. As a result, Wilson felt compelled to compromise his racial beliefs in order to maintain American safety and security. On May 18th, Woodrow Wilson signed into law the Selective Service Act of 1917, requiring all men in the United States between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the draft, including African American men. During the bill's debate, many Southern congressmen, including Senator James Vardaman of Mississippi, fought against African American involvement in the military, claiming that armed African Americans would only do harm.
The resistance to that came from various Southern politicians. They were worried about taking blacks into the Army and arming them, and training them, and give them military training. And what would it be like when they came back?
In order to appease the Southern congressmen and others with similar beliefs, as well as to prevent an African American uprising, President Wilson, with assistance from the Secretary of War Newton Baker, compromised. African Americans were thereby allowed to be drafted, but they were required to specify their race so that they could be placed into segregated units if drafted. This was the first time in history that African Americans were allowed in the draft. In his magazine The Crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois pushed African Americans to join the war effort in order for white Americans to witness the strength of African Americans. Within months, nearly 10 million men from around the country registered for the draft due to the Selective Service Act of 1917. 2 military divisions were created specifically for African Americans, The 92nd Infantry Division was classified as a support troop for the French and experienced some of the fiercest conflict in Europe. The 93rd Infantry Division was never fully formed except for the 369th Infantry Regiment, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters, who spent 191 days on the front-line trenches under the command of the French Army. These African American divisions were headed by white officers until the NAACP's strong advocacy efforts led to officer training for African Americans in the U.S. Army.
Most black troops were commanded by white officers. That was not such a happy experience because this was considered by these white officers to be, really, really bad assignment. And so they had a bunch of very resentful ones. It did not make for good relations. A lot of the officers who were assigned to lead black troops were hostile, very, very hostile, and racist.
The leading advocate of this plan was W.E.B. Du Bois, with support from black college students who visited Capitol Hill to express their support for a black officer training camp.
I'd say the whole reason they did this was practicality and political expediency. That means they needed bodies. If African Americans are citizens getting drafted in the military, they pushed, well, if we're going to be in the Army, we should be officers as well.
In May of 1917, Secretary Newton Baker decided that an Iowa training camp, Fort Des Moines, should provide black officer training under the command of Charles Clarendon Ballou. 1,250 of the most qualified African Americans volunteered for officer training. These prospective officers trained for 16 hours every day, but were denied machine gun, engineering, and artillery training, as they were deemed to possess inferior mental capacity to that of white soldiers. Although the opportunity for African Americans to serve as officers was a sign of racial progress, it was a source of conflict near Fort Des Moines. In fact, groups of local citizens gathered to protest the training of black officers, and many local businesses denied service to black officer trainees. However, this poor treatment largely ceased once newspaper articles reported their good behavior and rapid progress in the camp. In one article, Colonel Ballou stated, "The boys are far more obedient and much less difficult to handle than a similar body of white men. They learn rapidly. We have the making of a large number of good officers." The 639 men who graduated from officer training at Fort Des Moines were sent to the 92nd Division in France, where they led African American troops who fought valiantly for the Allied cause. Many members of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions received honors for their bravery and leadership, including Corporal Freddie Stowers of the 93rd Division, who received the Medal of Honor for his bravery, leadership, and perseverance during a trench attack. After the war, many officers returned home where they shifted their attentions to civil rights. For example, Charles H. Houston of Howard University became a civil rights lawyer who advocated for black commissioned officers in World War II, and paved the way for President Harry Truman's issuance of Executive Order 9981 in 1949 that allowed for the racial integration of troops. During the Korean conflict in 1951, the last segregated military unit, the all-black 24th Regiment, was disbanded, removing the last remnant of military segregation. Later, not only did soldiers of all races fight side by side, some assumed even greater roles, such as African-American General Colin Powell, who led U.S. troops to victory in Iraq during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and became Secretary of State in the Bush administration. Today, multitudes of African American soldiers lead and serve in the military with no legal limitations on their full participation. Thus, when President Woodrow Wilson compromised his entrenched beliefs about race by signing the Selective Service Act in 1917, he unknowingly empowered black leadership and promoted the path to progress in overcoming centuries of racial conflict in America through advances in civil rights.